From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on Middle East affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Fadi Nicholas Nassar, U.S Lebanon Fellow at MEI and Director of the Institute for Social Justice, an Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Lebanese American University. Today I'll be talking with the award-winning founder of the popular newsletter Sa'alouni El Nas, Danny Hajjar. Danny brings with him a diverse and eclectic background that weaves together a genuine love for music, culture, activism, advocacy, and diaspora engagement. In doing so, he helps amplify the intersections of all of these in Lebanon and the broader region. Thank you very much for being here with us, Danny.
Thank you so much.
I thought I'd start off this conversation with an introduction to some of our listeners who might not be too familiar with your newsletter. Can you tell us what inspired you to launch a newsletter in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for having me here. Join y'all for this. This newsletter was kind of born out of a desire to showcase our different creative musical talents. I think a lot of the focus when it comes to Arabic music tends to be on Arab pop music, for many understandable reasons. It's catchy, it's danceable, it's nostalgic, but I had a desire to want to showcase all the other different genres and artists that are, either in the Middle East, North Africa, or part of the diaspora that are also really doing some interesting music. And I have been toying with that idea to do that in 2020. And then the Port of Beirut blast happened in August, and the focus of the newsletter kind of morphed just a bit to not only be about the music and the culture, but also to have a dedicated section every week to Lebanon and what's going on there. And I thought of it as a very, very small way to kind of make sure that people were aware of what was going on, how we were or weren't holding people accountable for what took place, and just all the different developments in the country. So it's a combination of things. And then later on, as the newsletter progressed, I wanted to do something where I could highlight different people within the community who are just doing really interesting things. But instead of asking them about their jobs or their careers, I wanted to ask them about their go-to music. And so I would ask them questions along the lines of, what are some songs that you listen to when you're feeling down? What are some songs that you know all the words to? And for me, it felt like that really humanized people that I admire, people that I think the community admires, and it brings some kind of a connection between all of us and that person through music, which I think is really, really cool.
Thanks. No, fascinating stuff. If you don't mind me asking, you mentioned the Port of Beirut, the blast of the Port of Beirut blast. What was it in particular that drove this general sense of advocacy for you and uplifting of some very important causes in Lebanon?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm Lebanese. My parents came to the U.S. during the Civil War. So I'm a first generation American, and Lebanon is very near and dear to my heart and who I am. And so that sense of activism had kind of been there since I was a child, really. We would go and stay 5 months out of the year in Lebanon for almost every year up until I was about 18 and started college. So this was nothing new to me in terms of wanting to do something for the country, even though, I would never compare myself to actual activists and organizers that are putting in the work every day. What I was trying to do was try to use my newsletter as a vehicle to show people who suddenly felt aware of what was going on in Lebanon, or suddenly, had started to pay a little bit of attention because of the blast. I wanted to use that newsletter to keep the momentum going and just continue to educate and show people about what was going on in the country and what was going on with our people. So for me, that sense of activism has always kind of been there. And it was, I think, a little bit more formalized with the newsletter.
And how have you found the reception to mixing music, artistry with such advocacy?
I think people appreciate it. I think people really appreciate the stories. The stories that I tend to include aren't explicitly political. I try not to include too many stories that are, for example, Lebanese parliament, failed to elect a president for the 10th time. If you want that news, you can find it in many other venues. What I would want to try to do is say, why is this community in Tripoli so affected by the compounding crises that are happening, and try to humanize all the different political pieces that are going on. Those are the stories that kind of most interest me. Now, granted, the newsletter, I think, has its reputation and its fame for the music that I include, which I'm okay with. I think that's fair, and that was the original intention of the newsletter. And so I do appreciate the fact that people tend to go there for the different playlists, the different artists, and everything in that realm. But I do think it's a good mix, and it's something that I hope to continue doing.
Something I find so interesting is the diverse audience and following you have. I mean, on my end, I see academics, music lovers, activists. Who have you felt you reach with the newsletter?
Wow, that's a really good question. I feel like I've reached people who just love music, and in that space, there are academics, there are other artists, there are chefs, there are activists, there are writers, journalists. I mean, it kind of really runs the gamut of professions that people have. And frankly, it runs the gamut of communities in terms of where they live. So, one thing I really want to try to do with the newsletter, no matter what the content is to make sure that it's not just people in the diaspora that feel connected to something, but that people living in the Middle East, North Africa feel like this is an accurate representation of what's going on and what's happening. And I want them to also feel connected, and through that kind of bridge different gaps or what have you between diaspora communities and local communities. And so that's really been a highlight for me, is to see people living in Tunisia connect with people living in Australia, who are connecting with people living in the UK, and connecting with people living in Beirut. And so it's such a beautiful thing, I think, to kind of cultivate that digital community.
No, no, definitely. I want to switch over a bit to, I guess a good segue is always Feiruz. You have a clear appreciation for Feiruz, as so many of us do. At such a time, and I know it's one of those things that words can never fully capture and at times can come off as trite. But what is it about Feiruz for you that stands out or that inspired at least the title?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. The title of the newsletter, Sa'alouni El Nas, which translates pretty much to "the people asked me," right? Felt so apt for this newsletter. Now, whether or not people asked me to do a newsletter or not is a whole other question, admittedly. But in a way, I didn't want to stick with something that was like, here's the news or here's the music. It just felt it felt right that the title of the newsletter also be a song title by one of my favorite songs by Feiruz. And with her, she's such a revered person in Lebanon. You could argue probably in the broader region too. She's also this kind of mythological figure in a way, which I just find so fascinating about her. I think there's a whole, I'm not quite sure the word that I'm looking for right now, but there's this whole character of who she is and what she represents. And so, I think she's just a fascinating artist in our history. And, I think the title just made a lot of sense to do it that way. And it's someone that everybody, whether you're young or old or what have you, listen to Arabic music or don't listen to Arabic music, you can kind of see why the title of the newsletter is what it is.
Certainly. And are there any new artists in Lebanon right now that capture in their own way a similar spirit?
You mean in terms of kind of this mythological sort of sense? Is that what you mean?
Maybe, of course, not to the same levels as Feiruz, but that music can be something that transcends a lot of problems and challenges and gives hope and meaning and belonging.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so. I don't think there is an artist like that. Now, that's not to say that artists, that there aren't any good artists out there currently, and that we should only listen to Feiruz. That's not at all what I mean. But I think what Feiruz did, the era she came up with, or she came up in, excuse me, and what was happening in Lebanon at the time, particularly around the civil war, and what Feiruz chose to do and chose not to do, for example. I don't know that we've had someone like that in recent memory. I think she offers a lot of nostalgia to a lot of people, and the power of nostalgia is so great that, at least right now, I don't know that I can say there is anybody. Maybe in 50, 60, 70 years, who knows if someone will point back to a current artist and say, you know what, this is my Feiruz. But at the moment, I think Feiruz is just such a unique artist character, really, in Lebanese history and in the history of the region, because she did do quite a few songs for Palestine as well, and I want to acknowledge that. But I would say, she is just someone that has transcended that to the point where political leaders meet with her for for PR purposes and things like that, and there's a reason behind why that happens, right? So yeah, I can't think of an artist currently, but who's to say that that artist can't exist?
No, no, certainly. I understand the icon status of Feiruz, and as you put it, the particular period, the nostalgic period. But perhaps let me rephrase the question. We're also at a defining point in history in Lebanon right now, a moment that saw pain, that saw revolution, that saw injustice, different, very radically different emotions over the past few years. I'm wondering about the music scene in the past few years, in the past 3 years in particular, since 2019. Have you noticed, or has something stood out to you about the songs, the artistry or the music that has come out in this time?
That's a good question. I think around the Dauda in 2019 in October, obviously I think there was quite a bit of hope and quite a bit of jubilation. And so what I noticed, at least in the protests that were happening across the country, is you had a lot of people gravitate toward sort of electronic music, a lot of house music, which tends to be something that Lebanon and Beirut in particular is known for, bringing in these DJs and doing house music. That's a genre that's very popular, obviously, in the country. And so you had a kind of a continuation of that, and you had sort of different chants against political leaders be remixed into house songs and have a thumping beat in the background, which I thought was very cool. Since that time, and I think particularly since the blast in August 2020, a lot of the sort of more popular artists, I think they've shied away from doing hopeful music in that way. And frankly, I think they've shied away from really talking about politics, which I don't think, you can have an opinion one way or another about what that looks like. But some of the bigger artists, I mean, I'm talking at the levels of like Danny Hajjar and Raghab Alemi, like those folks, I think have shied a little bit away from getting too explicitly involved or saying anything publicly. That being said, I think what we have seen is a burgeoning indie scene where artists, I think, are not shy to call out political leaders, not shy to call out the horrific collapse of the country. And I think you've got, rappers and MCs. Hip hop is a genre of protest, and so naturally, I think you have those artists in Lebanon who are rapping, who are doing that, creating music to kind of reflect that situation. I think Blue Pfeiffer is a great example of that. She was someone who came out with a song called Sintel Ew, and it was just literally a recap of, I think it was 2020, and just how horrible 2020 was for Lebanese, and just calling that out. And so you definitely have artists that are doing that in that way. But I think some of the bigger artists are not. And that is, I think, the difference between, for example, someone like Feiruz, who was a massive artist, who still is a massive artist, frankly. She was the number 2 streamed artist in the region on Spotify, which says something about her music. But, you have someone at that level who is singing about these different situations and that sort of thing, especially with, her collaborations with Ziad Rahbani, who he clearly is not shy about talking about the situations and musically and calling things out. Compare that to the artists today that would be considered at that same sort of level in terms of pop music and popular music. They're not necessarily doing that. And so you have to kind of look towards some of the more, I don't want to say niche genres, but genres that aren't getting as much maybe attention in Lebanon as they should be. You look to those artists, for example, to kind of make sense of the situation musically.
Any artists you want to give a particular shout out to?
Oh yeah, I want to give a shout. Big. I mean, I gave her a big shout out, but I love Blue Pfeiffer. I think Blue Pfeiffer is one of the most fascinating rappers to come out of Lebanon. Nuj and UJ is also another one that I want to give a big shout out to. Really, anyone that is working with Beirut City Records, like I want to give them a shout out. They're doing a lot of really interesting hip hop right now, and so I would definitely give them all a shout out.
You mentioned DC. How about the Lebanese music artistry in the diaspora? Are there more bridges emerging between, let's say, Lebanon and the diaspora, or some new divides that are materializing?
Musically, you mean?
Musically, collaborate in terms of collaboration, engagement with one another, visions of Lebanon.
Yeah, I don't think it has happened yet, or at least not on the level that you see other communities do it. For example, I think you see that happen far more in the Sudanese music scene, particularly with Sudanese hip hop, than you do in the Lebanese music scene. I think you see that a little bit more with the Palestinian music scene, for example. So it hasn't really happened yet for what I imagine would be a variety of different reasons, but it would be cool to see that. I mean, I'm all for collaboration. I'm all for all of us kind of working together and creating really cool music and interesting music. So, I'm sure at some point it'll happen. It has not really materialized as of yet.
Let me ask you, how do you find yourself living in Washington and engaging with core causes in Lebanon, some of them that inspired you to start this newsletter?
Yeah, I mean, what's nice is good contingent. There's a good contingent of Lebanese diaspora in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, and so it's being part of those different groups, being plugged into kind of what's happening, seeing where I can be useful in terms of how I can be supportive, but really too, it's being connected with friends and family in Lebanon directly, hearing from them and seeing what's going on and how we can be most helpful, how we can ensure that what we're doing is actually making a positive impact. I think for me, at least first and foremost, what I try to do is to focus on my family and see kind of what's going on with them and where I can be supportive of them. Because at the end of the day, I think that's what we all in the diaspora tend to focus on, and I think that's a good start, is focusing on our families and seeing what's where we can all be helpful and kind of seeing where the most personal impact is happening.
Powerful words. To that, let me just ask a question about the larger diaspora in terms of a more regional outlook, whether in Washington or in the United States. Have you felt your newsletter helps bring together different communities, engage one another with music, artistry? I'm just curious if you've got any of that feedback.
Yeah, I definitely think it has, even if it's on a very small level. I've gotten emails from people that I don't know, emails from people that I do know, who have told me, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool that this person in San Francisco is doing this. I live in Paris and I want to help them." Or "Oh my gosh, I would have never known about this really cool thing that's happening in Cairo. I want to learn more about it. I'm living in Orlando, Florida." Like things like that is, I've gotten that feedback and it's really cool. That to me feels incredibly rewarding to see how people across different countries and communities are finding ways to connect with each other through this newsletter, or finding ways to relate to each other through this newsletter. I mean, that to me is just, it's a beautiful thing. And I love to see that. I love to find ways to bring us all together in that way, and to find some sense of connection between all of us. And music is a powerful connector.
Certainly. Your newsletter, certainly transcends Lebanon. Are there any cross-cutting themes that you've noticed in some of the new artistry that is coming out in the past few years and music in the region?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think, I tend to listen to a lot of rap and hip hop. So I think you're seeing a lot of artists experiment more with the beat structures than I think you had in the past. Like, for example, you're seeing a lot of drill music happening. North African artists, I think in particular, are doing a lot of Afro beats music and collaborating with East African and West African artists, which I think is very fascinating. I think you're seeing kind of a really cool period of time for Iraqi rap, for example. So there are things that kind of are taking place that, just from my vantage point, I'm starting to notice. But at the end of the day, I think what's really cool is that we're all doing something really interesting. Every community is trying to do something really cool. And I think on some level, you're seeing artists from different communities collaborate with each other. And that is, at the end of the day, one of the coolest things. I think that's what I've noticed. And, it's fun to watch.
If you don't mind me asking, is there any particular sort of new music that is emerging from, let's say, within the diaspora community in the United States or outside?
Yeah, I think you're starting to see a lot of diaspora artists incorporate both English and Arabic into their music, which I can't say that I have seen too much of before when I was growing up and everything, and and seeing that and listening to music. So you're seeing younger artists now like Bayou, and you're seeing artists like Saint Levant, you're seeing artists like Lana Lubani, who are all finding ways to incorporate Arabic that way along with English. And they're doing very well. I mean, they're very successful at it. So I think and they're successful at it not just within the diaspora communities, right? They're successful at it just with a general audience. And so I think that's been a really cool thing to see, is more and more people be exposed to the Arabic language in that way, and be exposed to our music in that way. I think Fauzia is also another one that does that really well. There are a lot, and I'm sure I'm missing quite a few people, but I think that is something that I've started to notice, is to hear more Arabic mixed in with English, and I think that's very reflective of a lot of experiences in the diaspora, as us, using multiple languages to communicate. Now you're hearing that reflected in the music. I think that's a really, really important thing.
And I'm curious, is that well received? Does it travel back to their respective home communities?
I think it is well received. I mean, some of these artists are going and performing at some of the bigger music conferences and festivals. Most recently, the ones that happened in Dubai and in Riyadh. Like, you're seeing some of these diaspora artists, participate there and being part of that. And so, I think it is happening, and I think a lot of that too has to do with some of the previous sort of artists that paved the way for these newer artists to come through. So I'm talking about guys like Narcy and Omar Effendum, and these folks who they were among the first to do it, and they were among the only ones really to do it. And now you're seeing a plethora of artists start to do it, and I think them two and others really paved the way for this new generation to kind of take hold. And so I do think you are seeing that well received kind of back in the region as well.
Mm-hmm. I've got to ask, it's the end of the year. Who was on your top three list, the Spotify wrap up?
Oh man. Well, Drake was number one for me, which people can make of that what they will. Bad Bunny was number two for me. Also, people can make of that what they will. And then a good friend of mine who put out her first album this year. Her name is Nadina Ruby. She is a Sudanese artist, and she does really, really cool kind of R&B and very sultry sort of music. And so they were my top 3 artists on Spotify this year.
That's amazing. Shout out to her. Hope we can find a way to amplify her new album. Congratulations. All right. With that, thank you so much for your time, Danny. It's wonderful talking to you. Any last words you might have for our listeners?
I just want to say thank you again for this opportunity. It was really cool to be here, really cool to chat with you about music and kind of the happenings and everything. And please subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't already. And if you've got any feedback, I would love to hear it, or any suggestions for any folks to sort of guest feature. I'm all ears. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thank you for your time, and congrats again on your award.
Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.